I want to talk to you about the Joe Rogan Experience, a wonderful podcast, the number one podcast in the whole world, and what you can learn from Joe Rogan himself. Okay, so let's talk about the podcast to start with. If you think about the Joe Rogan Experience, I want you to think about a podcast that's been around for more than 10 years, actually, 15 years, going into the 20th year. Fantastic. Okay, and the thing is that nowadays the Joe Rogan Experience is actually the number one, but it was never like that. It started really small, and it was like back in the days, like 15 to 20 years ago. Joe Rogan himself was actually struggling with his podcast. Okay, but it's because the character himself, Joe himself, is a fantastic storyteller. He's a very resilient storyteller that he's able to get to the level where he's at right now. Okay, when you think about the story of Joe Rogan, I want you to think about stories of resilience, but most importantly, stories of discipline. So if you think about the podcast itself, this is a very long podcast. Don't think about a 30-minute podcast, a 1 hour podcast. You are with the Joe Rogan Experience. You are talking about maybe 3 to 4 hours. What I love about Joe Rogan, the podcast, is that basically he takes the time to delve into issues, to really go to deep dive into issues. And you know what? The audience loves it. I love it too, and I think you should. So if you're thinking about emulating Joe Rogan in your podcast, you have to understand that you have to speak about something that your audience wants to hear about. Don't just waste people 3 hours or 4 hours trying to really talk about everything and anything. No, you have to be disciplined in terms of the topic that you are choosing. But most importantly, you have to be great at storytelling. So if you're having an interview, because the podcast, Joe will sit down with one or two characters, okay, and would basically just have a long form conversation. I mean, one of the most prominent was when he interviewed President Trump, okay, a couple of months ago. A lot of folks were pretty surprised. But hey, listen, that's what I love with Joe. He's able to do things unconventionally. Okay, so that's an important element. So the podcast itself is a pretty straightforward podcast. Pretty straightforward. It's an interview style. Okay, and Joe sits for 3 hours and talks about the host talks about. I mean, the host talks about the guest, talks about a topic, and it really the format hasn't really changed that much. Okay, it's true that when Joe started this 15 to 20 years ago, basically he was doing it in a much smaller place. But nowadays the studio actually has gotten bigger, and the staff behind Joe has become more prominent too. So if you think about the Joe Rogan Experience, you have to understand that the podcast went through a series of what I call a series of phases. There were a couple of trains. Okay, so when Joe started, like 2005, he was actually on. I mean, by the way, what you need to understand is that Joe is a former UFC fighter, so he has that resilience, that determination, that discipline already. But when he started back in the days, he was on Apple Podcasts. Okay, then you have the YouTube era. So he actually transitioned to YouTube, and he even increased his audience big time when he went to YouTube. Why? Because basically, I mean, YouTube, you have 2 to 3 billion folks who are tuning into YouTube every single month. That's a large traffic. So from YouTube, I mean, Joe went to the Joe Rogan Experience, started being featured on YouTube around 2013. 2013, that's when Joe really made the move to go on YouTube, and that was great because that was at a time when YouTube wasn't really known for a podcasting platform. Okay, so but after 10, 15 years, the rest is history, because you can see that Joe really made a good decision to actually move to YouTube. So then after YouTube, you also have the Spotify era. So in 2020, like during COVID, Joe actually made the decision to actually have a partnership with Spotify, where he actually let's say I won't say permanently, but I would just say let's just say for a short period of time, transition his podcast to Spotify. He actually signed a multi-million-dollar contract with Spotify, exclusivity contract, and that was pretty good. I mean, a lot of folks said, well, that was not the right move, but Joe is a pretty savvy businessman. He knows what he's doing. Okay, so the format of the episode hasn't changed. But by the way, he came back to YouTube though. He came back to YouTube, so he's actually on YouTube and Spotify. Okay, and he's also every now and then on Apple Podcasts. But the format hasn't changed. Okay, you have Joe sitting having interview style. Very very rarely that does he have group sessions if he has more than one guest. So it is what it is. So one thing I want you to really understand is that the Joe Rogan Experience has also gotten through a transition phase during COVID because basically what happens here is that basically everybody was home all of a sudden. We didn't have to go to work, and a lot of folks were binge listening to podcasts, including the Joe Rogan Experience. And what I really found interesting is that Joe Rogan has such a large followership that even during COVID, he didn't lose them. I mean, a lot of businesses were closing here and there, but Joe Rogan, a lot of podcasts also were shutting down left and right. But the Joe Rogan Experience actually grew stronger. So that's really important. That's really important to see the resilience I was talking to you about a little earlier. Okay, and one thing I want to say also is that of course some people don't like the fact that Joe every now and then will have insensitive language. Sometimes he will be marred in controversial comments. Okay, or sometimes people. I mean, see, the whole thing about Joe Rogan is that either you like him or you don't like him. This is somebody who is. This is just the way he is. I personally love him because he's a straightforward. He's a straight shooter. He tells the way it is, and he makes choices. Okay. Now, if you want to be a successful podcaster like Joe, you got to really stand for your ground. You got to really stand for what you believe in, no matter what people say. It's not about the opinions of others. It's what you're trying to build with your audience. Okay, the connection you have with your audience. That's the most important thing. Let me give you an example. I mean, when it comes to like when it comes to controversial comments, people talked about racism, talk about things that like World War II issues with the Nazis. I mean, Joe has dabbled into all those topics every now and then. But what I want to say here is that this is somebody who is just a straight shooter. You might not like it, but at least he tells it the way he feels it, and that's important because the audience. If you do the same thing, I mean, I'm not saying you should really follow Joe's footsteps, but if you are honest, your honesty will be rewarded. Your audience will appreciate their honesty, okay, and will always at least they know where you stand, which is a lot better than being wishy-washy. If you're wishy-washy, that's really bad for your brain also. For your brain also. So if you think about the Joe Rogan experience, I just talked to you about the podcast, but I want to talk to you quickly about Joe Rogan himself. Okay, the character. Now, Joe Rogan has been a stand-up comedian for over 30 years. See, the whole thing is people think that Joe Rogan is a podcaster, but no, he's a stand-up comedian. He does comedy. Okay, as a matter of fact, he has Netflix deals. Okay, that's a really important element to think about. Of course, Joe before he became a comedian, he was actually he was given. I mean, he was a fighter. Okay, he was a UFC fighter himself, but he also became a color commentator for UFC. Okay, so the thing is, if you think about Joe Rogan, I want you to think about a compilation of a skill set. He's a martial artist. This is somebody who has been working hard, who has been fighting since he was little. Okay, so you don't have just a podcaster. You have an eclectic personality, and that's what the audience really likes. The fact that this guy knows a lot of stuff, has done a lot of stuff. So what he brings to his podcast, it's not just like certain knowledge on a specific topic. Of course, he does research. His team does research for him. They'll probably give him some preparation notes or whatever. But the guy himself, Joe himself, is so talented, so resilient, so disciplined that you cannot not like this character. I mean, you have to really. I mean, I personally, I mean, I've been listening to the Joe Rogan Experience for 15 to like 10 to 15 years, and I've seen Joe becoming like improving all the time. He improves all the time. Okay, this is just fantastic. So, why do people love the JRE, the Joe Rogan Experience? Let's talk about it. And what can you learn from that podcast? Okay, the thing is that the Joe Rogan Experience has been successful for the last 10 to 15 years. First, because Joe has identified his niche very well. He knows that people appreciate the fact that he can convey his passions, his expertise, his storytelling, and most importantly, his integrity. So when he talks, you know it's coming from the heart. Okay, so his niche appreciates that. His niche appreciates the fact that I mean, his target audience. I mean, his audience is composed primarily of males. Okay, males from 25 all the way to 55. So that's a large bracket. I mean, he does have some female listeners, but his listeners are primarily and predominantly males. Okay, and what I want to say here is that, and those males, those men, they appreciate Joe's straight shooter style. Okay, so he has done a great job in identify his niche, and Joe understands very well his audience. Okay, it's one of those things where he understands what resonates with his audience, and you can see that in the way he chooses his guests. Okay, I mean, Joe receives hundreds of guest solicitations every month, but his team and he and his team know how to filter out the less interesting and just retain the most interesting. That's because he knows his audience pretty well. Okay, and the reason why he knows his audience very well is that his team conducts market research all the time. I mean, Joe at his level, even though he's the number one podcast globally, he's still doing market research to identify new angles, to identify new strategies, new trends that he can really he and his team can actually take advantage of. Okay, at least add value to the audience. Okay, and Joe does a great job. Also, the reason why people love JRE, the Joe Rogan Experience, is also because you can see that the podcast is actually planned. Nothing is left to chance, and yeah, and you have to really maybe emulate that skill set too. Planning your podcast, okay, making sure that you are developing a consistent format. You are creating a content calendar. You are planning your episodes, okay, and that's an important element. I mean, planning your episode is going to help you big time. Actually, resonate more with your audience. And another reason why people love the Joe Rogan Experience is that it's not about having fancy equipment. Okay, the studio itself is not really that fancy, but the electricity, the magnetism, the fact that Joe Rogan himself has a magnetic personality is actually very beneficial to the whole setting. So if you want to really be as successful as Joe Rogan, try to have some kind of personality. You don't have to be like Joe Rogan, but try to have your own personality, but be dynamic, okay, and communicate that dynamism to your audience. Let's talk about money, money, money. How does Joe generate ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching? How the Joe Rogan Experience gets monetized, and you'll be really interested. I mean, you'll be really interested because Joe has proven that his business model is very solid. Okay, very solid. Anytime I analyze his business model, I cannot really, stop appreciating how smart Joe really is. Because people think, well, Joe is just an entertainer. Of course, he's an entertainer, but he's also a businessman. So he first makes money through sponsorships and advertising. So you have tons of sponsors who are willing to do business with Joe. Okay, and he also does advertising. In other words, he makes money anytime his podcast is actually played on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Okay, he's collecting dollars every now and then. He's collecting revenue, and also there are let's say scenarios where some listeners will just give donation. I mean, Joe will appreciate donations, no problem. He doesn't need it, but if you are a listener and you appreciate the work he's doing, he is and his team are doing, you can really donate. Okay, so Joe actually accept donations also. You also have merch sales. So you have the Joe Rogan Experience. You have a lot of merch really out there. Okay, and by the way, the thing is that you have to understand with Joe Rogan, it's not just about one source of revenue. It's about having multiple sources of revenue. So he makes money through merch sales. He makes money through affiliate marketing. He makes money through his own comedy events. Okay, I mean he has deals with he has deals with Netflix, but he has comedy event. Don't forget that Joe Rogan is primarily a comedian. Okay, I mean of course he's a UFC fighter, but he's also a comedian, a very accomplished comedian, a very talented comedian. Okay, a very forceful comedian, a hard worker. Okay, so you can see someone who has multiple sources of revenue, multiple avenues of revenue, and that's really what's sustaining Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan podcast, but also Joe Rogan himself as an entertainer. So one thing I want to say before I finish into this conversation is that you have Joe Rogan in the news. So Joe Rogan actually uses his personality, his comments, his like buzz around his name to generate exposure, extra exposure for his podcast. Okay, not just his podcast, but also his gazillion businesses on the side. Okay, but if you can see on the screen here, anytime you type Joe Rogan in the news in Google, you're gonna get like a multiple results. Okay, especially nowadays after he interviewed President Trump before the election, his fame, even though he was already famous, but the prominence of his podcast went even higher, big time. Okay, and what I want to say here is that Joe Rogan is, as a matter of fact, Joe Rogan loves being in the news. He's an entertainer, so he appreciates whenever people are talking about him. That's how he can actually reach or even maintain prominence. Okay, and what I want to say here is that what you want to see every time you go and type Joe Rogan in the news, you will see that everything actually is directed at his podcast. The podcast is actually the foundation of the Joe Rogan. I mean, he likes to say the Joe Rogan experience, but I call it the Joe Rogan empire. So JRE, think about Joe Rogan empire, because everything starts with a podcast, and then from the podcast, things trickle down to, let's say, merch sales. Things trickle down to Netflix events, comedy events. Things trickle down to speaking engagements, for instance. Things to trickle down to, let's say, fan membership tiers. So that's an important element to think about. Okay, and one thing I want to say also is that if you pay attention to Joe Rogan in the news, you'll realize that basically it goes through ups and downs. There are moments when Joe Rogan is really pretty well known. He, like, everybody loves him, or at least the media talk about him. And there are others where his stars will fade a little bit. But hey, listen, that's just normal. This is how life goes on anyway. In conclusion to this conversation, I talked to you about the Joe Rogan experience, and I talked to you about the podcast, about Joe Rogan himself, why people love JRE, how JRE gets monetized, and also Joe Rogan in the news. Thank you so much. God bless you. I will see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.